The accounting scandal that Group 3 chose to research was the Ponzi scheme by white-collar conman Bernie Madoff, conducted over the course of multiple decades and robbing clients of billions of dollars.
In 1960, when Bernie Madoff was 22 years old, he opened up his trading operations, Bernard L. Madoff Investors Securities, LLC, also known as BLMIS. Between 1960 and 1970, Bernard L. Madoff Investor Securities became known for making third market over-the-counter trades that use innovative technology and bypass the New York Stock Exchange trading floor to make markets. Some of their technology is used in the creation of NASDAQ. The firm also opens up a private investment portfolio division where Madoff manages money for his investors, whose trades are processed through his firm. In 1989, Bernard L. Madoff Investors Securities, LLC became one of the largest independent trading operations in the securities industry. It is handling approximately 5% of the trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange at this time. Bernie Madoff is appointed to non-executive chairman of NASDAQ in 1990. During this time, his firm's private investment accounts continue to grow and report consistent growth with positive returns. Investors include hedge funds, large charitable foundations, individuals, and pension plans. Bernie Madoff's fame as an investment manager becomes more widespread when he is found to be a mystery manager of one of the feeder funds and is asked to reveal his strategy for his success. Bernie describes his strategy as a split strike conversion that uses option contracts on blue chip stock purchases to protect the portfolio's downside potential. At this point, multiple industry peers suspect something's not right with Madoff. They believe he may be front-running trades in his market-making unit.
A Ponzi scheme, also known as a pyramid scheme, deceives investors of the true nature of the services offered. Many times, the party responsible for conducting the scheme promises some sort of lucrative investment. Throughout the duration of the scheme, money from new investors is used to pay old investors. Therefore, a constant stream of cash and new investors is required to keep the scheme going. Ultimately, when no new investors are recruited, the scheme unravels. Another way Ponzi schemes collapse is if too many investors want to withdraw their funds at one period of time.
Bernie Madoff will forever be known as having the largest Ponzi scheme in United States history. He swindled his 4,800 investors out of $64.8 billion. During this time, he would take his investors' money and deposit it into a bank account rather than invest it. He would then pay small, consistent returns out of that bank account to his investors to show that he had legitimate business investment. When the clients wanted their money back, he would use that bank account to repay the requested funds using other investors' funds. He would accompany the investment return with a false investment portfolio to make it look like he had, in fact, invested that client's money. During his testimony, Bernie Madoff said he had worked alone, but he actually had help from 5 of his former employees who were found guilty for helping with this conspiracy. First came his secretary, Annette. She was his aide and helped him by making false return investment portfolios. She was arrested in 2010 and she was charged with conspiracy for security frauds. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Then came his director of operations, Daniel. Daniel was arrested in 2010 and charged with allegedly having created false and fraudulent books and records, conspiracy, security fraud, and tax-related charges. He is also being sued by the SEC for falsifying records. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Then came the investment advisor, Joanne. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison for falsifying investment returns. Then came computer programmers, George and Jerome, both of which used their computer skills to help make programs to falsify the documents that Madoff needed. The first person who publicly started questioning Bernie Madoff was American fund manager Harry Markopolos. He had nothing to do with the Ponzi scheme, but was just a self-confessed math geek who had become obsessed with this. He was dismissed as a misguided obsessive until Madoff eventually got caught. In 2008, when the market was declining, many of Madoff's investors were trying to withdraw their investments. This put a lot of stress on Bernie Madoff, who was unable to keep up. He then told his sons, Mark and Andrew, about what he had been doing. They in turn went to the FBI and turned him in. Madoff then also went to the FBI and turned himself in for what he had been doing to protect his family. He then pleaded guilty to 11 felony counts of money laundering, perjury, false filings with the SEC, and for fraud. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison for stealing the $64.8 billion from his investors. The imprisonment of Bernie Madoff was not enough for his investors. In 2009, $199 million lawsuit was filed against Mark and Andrew, Bernie's brother Peter, and his niece Shauna, all of which worked at his firm. 2 years after Bernie's arrest, his son Mark committed suicide, and a few years later, his son Andrew died of cancer. Bernie's brother Peter, although he says he didn't know about the scheme until his brother's arrest, was imprisoned for 10 years for his involvement. His niece, Shauna, was a lawyer for the firm but did not go to jail for any of her involvement. To date, $11.079 billion was returned to original investors out of Bernie's estate.
There are numerous reasons why Madoff was able to get away with his scheme for the amount of time that he did. First, Madoff required absolute discretion from those who were investing with him. He didn't want the knowledge of his investment business to become common knowledge. Why wouldn't he want this? Wouldn't this be good for business? Well, the SEC requires that investment managers who have 15 or more clients to be registered with the SEC. This would have required extensive audits and various other forms of oversight that may have exposed Madoff's true intentions. Additionally, there were numerous feeder funds and investment managers who had their hand in the pot. These feeder fund managers received very lucrative cuts from Madoff for their investors. They brought in a steady stream of new investors for Madoff and received millions of dollars in return. Also, Bernie was very persuasive and had an impeccable resume. Madoff was the chairman and helped found the NASDAQ exchange. He provided clients with steady returns year in and year out. Madoff's reputation for excellence allowed him to pull the wool over numerous people's eyes. Finally, there were numerous breakdowns in SEC oversight. This topic will be discussed further in the following slides. Who was responsible for not catching Madoff? The Securities and Exchange Commission is the body responsible for the regulation and oversight of the stock exchange. During multiple inspections, the SEC examiners and the SEC as a governing body made multiple errors. In April of 2005, young, inexperienced SEC examiners arrived at Madoff Securities to begin the initial investigation. These examiners also did not have the proper supervision and were greeted by Madoff himself at the door, which was extremely unusual. As a result, Madoff told stories and sweet-talked these young examiners. Madoff was able to cover up multiple red flags that surfaced. Then, in May of 2006, Bernie was subpoenaed to New York to testify at the SEC headquarters. His testimony was taken by SEC lawyers with one of the initial examiners present. Madoff's statement was full of contradictory statements and flat-out lies. When the examiner who initially investigated Madoff pointed out these contradictions, the lawyers didn't believe him. Instead, they believed in Madoff, who had a stellar resume and reputation. Why wasn't there any oversight by third-party auditors? To begin, Madoff had a very small CPA firm. This firm had a total of 3 employees, a secretary, a CPA, and a partner who resided in Florida. The tiny size of this CPA firm used by such a large business should have raised multiple red flags. In reality, Madoff essentially purchased the CPA license from the holder. This allowed Madoff's books to receive a clean bill of health. Even though Madoff hired a very small accounting firm, there were numerous large CPA firms conducting the audits of the various funds who were investing with Madoff. These large firms should have taken the very basic step of requesting the confirmation of assets for their clients. However, since Madoff was not a client of any of these firms, they weren't held liable for their lack of due diligence and professional skepticism. Investigators at the SEC completely failed in their investigation of Madoff. After Madoff confessed, he even admitted that he was surprised that the SEC did not catch him. Examiners made a couple of core mistakes. A lack of professional due diligence and skepticism by these investigators was one of these mistakes. If there was one task that the examiners could have taken that would have uncovered the fraud, it would have been the confirmation of assets by third parties. Another incredible fact in this case is that there was a whistleblower who was alerting the SEC to Madoff's fraud for nearly a decade before he turned himself in. A self-made investigator who worked for a competitor of Madoff by the name of Harry Markopoulos was the man who was blowing the whistle on Madoff. He was asked by his bosses to try to reverse engineer Madoff's investment strategy. However, he could not achieve the same returns as Madoff. He then began filing reports with the SEC. However, the SEC never properly followed through on these claims. As a direct result of the failures by the SEC in investigating Madoff, the SEC made significant changes in their policies. The SEC even went as far as to publish a document that is required reading for all SEC examiners on Madoff. Some of the specific changes implemented by the SEC will be discussed. First, the SEC restructured its enforcement division. This will allow them to properly investigate and do thorough due diligence on companies. They also implemented additional procedures to enhance safeguards for investors' assets. Basically, this means that the SEC has increased audits, reviews, and confirmations to protect assets. Something else that the SEC did was that they improved training for examiners. This leads to improving the fraud detection procedures and ultimately the security of the markets. They also began to target specific types of employees with specialized experiences, as well as encouraging current employees to achieve the Certified Fraud Examiner designation. Finally, the SEC improved internal controls to improve effectiveness and efficiency, along with numerous other improvements.
The collapse of Madoff's fraudulent investment firm has caused a major impact to businesses and investors in the United States as well as internationally. They owed over $50 billion to some of the largest international banks, hedge funds, pension funds, charities, and many wealthy investors. This resulted in huge losses for several financial institutions, bankruptcies for some of the smaller banks, and financial devastations for hospitals, universities, and other organizations. Some of Madoff's clients in the United States that suffered the greatest losses include Fairfield Greenwich Advisors, who had $7.5 billion of their $14.1 billion in total assets under management were connected to Madoff. There was also Tremont Group, an asset management firm that lost more than half of their assets with the $3.3 billion that they invested. The affected businesses and investors were not limited to the United States. Some of Madoff's international clients that suffered the greatest losses include Banco Santander, a Spanish bank which had a total loss of $2.87 billion. There was also Bank Medici, an Austrian bank that had two funds with a total of $2.1 billion. There was also Fortis, a Dutch bank, Union Bancaire, a Swiss bank, and HSBC, a British bank, that suffered losses of $1.35 billion, $7 billion, and $1 billion, respectively. Other than direct financial impact, Madoff also affected investor confidence. It is vital for investors to make investments as related to economic growth, the size of firms, financial development, and international trade. However, if investors lose their confidence or trust in financial advisors and the companies, and believe that the risk of their investment is too high, and they are unlikely to get a return or possibly lose all of their assets, they'll probably not want to invest and likely withdraw their investments. From a study by Noah Stoffman, Associate Professor of Finance at Indiana University, and Scott Yonker, Assistant Professor of Finance at Cornell University, they argue that these fraud cases have effects that are far beyond direct investments that were lost by the victims. From their findings, it shows that public trust in the financial system was affected, especially for those that live close to the victims of the Madoff case. They believe this was due to the increased awareness of fraud either through social interactions with victims or increased coverage of the victims that are affected in their area. These investors that live close to the victims move substantial amounts of money out of their portfolios into safer cash deposits at federally insured banks. They estimated an amount of approximately $430 billion that was moved by investors out of these portfolios as a result of their decrease in trust. Stoffman and Yonker also found no evidence that these withdrawals were reversed, even 4 years after the Madoff case, and proved that these trust shocks have a long-term effect on investor confidence. After the Madoff scandal, the accounting profession and the auditing standards that were set were highly criticized and put under inspection. The three main areas of CPA practice that were affected as a direct result of the Madoff fraud are audit procedures, advisory services, and tax services. With audit procedures, Freeling and Horowitz, the audit firm for Madoff's operations, was not qualified to conduct the audit and therefore raised awareness. The auditors of the feeder funds, hedge funds, investment organizations, and others who invested with Madoff should have checked on the small firm that issued the reports in which they relied on. With advisory services, there were lawsuits that would affect investment advisors, trustees, fiduciaries, and anyone who had advisory related role to any organization and any person who lost big with Madoff. With tax services, tax preparers had no obligation to go further than using the information that they have been provided to prepare the tax returns. However, they might still have been affected.